you do mention in the book at some point, and this would have been before COVID, right? I'm trying to think, the book is 2017, maybe 2018. But you mentioned something about how people are increasingly staying at home and engaging with the world through various forms of social media, I think you also imply. So, I mean, that would be interesting to think about the historical dimension of anxiety and the historical dimension of what is often referred to as hysteria. But I just want to give you a quote. This is from the chapter in your book, Coitus Interruptus. You talk about anxiety clearly a lot, obviously, in that chapter. But I just wanted to give you the quote because it brings in the historical dimension. So on page 157, you say, the structure of the drive must also be a question of social and historical configurations. The whole sexual apparatus of anxiety in Freud is not merely anxiety about sex or because of sex, though that comes up, but instead confirms the tight relationship between sexuality and anxiety in the determination of social forms. What do we do with anxiety? So I suppose, I'm just interested if you could offer a little bit more about that dimension of social forms, and also the nice Lacanian move to talk about the structure of the drive being a question of social and historical configurations. Any thoughts?
No, it's very important, especially nowadays when people come and they say, I have an anxiety disorder, as if it's simply a biological problem. And one thing we know is that a person has to pass through their anxiety. And I think, insofar as there's this tight dialectic that, of course, I think, in my Lacanian bias, I think Lacan emphasized it more than other theorists, perhaps, that the dialectic between civilization, sexuality, and neurosis is going to determine, how different structures appear, or what's solidified in some ways or fragmenting in others. And I do have the feeling that there's more anxiety than I remember in my, in my early practice. And that I think that this has to be thought about as an analyst, not just because you're dealing with it in the consulting room, but you're also trying to listen to what your patients are saying about the world, about how the world has shaped them, and to give them back, to give that back to them is an enormous help, because it's not just simply their problem, right? It's not just simply their anxiety disorder. It's not just simply the chemical.
Yes.
And, together you and the patient learn something about the moment in which they're living. And I find this, not just edifying for me, which is why I would then write a book like I wrote, but also, incredibly important for the patient, him or herself. And I do think that for me, I don't know, the Freudian Lacanian perspective on this, it's also what's important to me about conversion disorder is something that's not simply a discrete diagnosis, but that I want to stretch, throughout history and look at the ways in which it appears and disappears. I don't know. It really helps you listen to patients and learn what they have to say about the moment in which they come to you.
This may be a related question, but what I was curious about reading through the book is the number of times that you end up referring to separation. And early on in the introduction, you mention it and you say, this brings me to an unexpected trope that emerged when writing this book about conversion, namely separation. So I'm curious to know more about separation. You then follow that note with a few critical remarks on how separation has become a bit of a mainstay, actually, in everyday psychological language. So you've got some critical remarks about it, but you also then follow up by saying, and I'll quote you again, the idea of separation is also at the heart of most ideas concerning autonomy in the wake of ego psychology. So that's part of the critique. But then you go on also to link separation to the importance of, I think this is on page 28, conversion is seeking not merely a transformation, but an act of radical separation or division. Anyways, well, give us the benefit of your thoughts, Jamieson.
Absolutely. It did surprise me. I don't know, I'd actually like to think about it more at some point as to, why I started down this road, and that its sort of appearance surprised me as much as it did. But the idea of for example, the Freudian trope about conversion, that it's the aptitude for transposing large quantities of energy from one place to another. that division implies a kind of separation, that kind of splitting already in the importance of the transformation and the production of the symptom is itself a separation. And maybe hasn't been recognized as such, maybe doesn't need to be recognized as such, because insofar as it relieves you of anxiety, great, right? And that the way in which it's restructuring the mind is of benefit to the patient. You as an analyst might listen to that transformation, that symptomatic formation, and play with it throughout a patient's treatment, because it's a point of, it's an achievement, as Freud said. Freud says it's a real achievement. And I think that we do listen for that as analysts. We listen to the moment in which somehow the patient, him or herself, has created something psychically that has been of value to them. And what I started to hear in that was actually the separation itself, that the symptom sort of represents a way in which they differentiate, separate, let's say, from the primordial object, right? And in Lacan, the coitus interruptus is funny, because I loved the fact that he was looking at Freud's early theory of anxiety that everyone makes fun of, that the reason that you have anxiety is because you've had bad sex, more or less. You've had a bad orgasm. And so you're sexually frustrated, and this is what's making you anxious, and then Freud said, okay, fine, this is stupid. I need a better theory than this. Lacan said he was actually onto something from the very beginning. And it's absolutely brilliant, his early interpretation, despite himself, which is that the reason that there might be a relationship between, let's say, coitus interruptus, pulling out, bad sex, anorgasmic sex, and anxiety is not because you're frustrated or because your drive is frustrated necessarily, but because your expectation for oneness or for a lack of separation then meets with an absolute separation, meaning my pleasure and your pleasure are in very different places, right? And then that would lead to the sort of eruption of anxiety. So already in that moment, he's saying that there's a separation that's felt as such at a moment that is very difficult to sort of psychically process, I guess I would say. So I started picking up the theme there, and I was, interested in it, in its sort of appearance in this sort of early moment of Freud in relationship to anxiety and the desire for conversion or a need for conversion in that place. And in general, just hearing from patients the difficulties with separation and differentiation, which are as old as the day is long. And that's why I wanted to go back to some of the psychoanalytic theories that we want to push around a bit as Lacanians, whether it's ego psychology or even whether it's attachment theory, and say that a lot of us have this question of separation on our mind. That a lot of the theories are aiming for it, and maybe we need a better theorization of it, or maybe it's something that we can return to. For example, with attachment theory, it's interesting because I think at the core of attachment theory, there is an idea of the importance of separation. But with all of the emphasis on attachment, you often find some of the theories or the way that it's taken going in the opposite direction, as if what's important is perfect attunement, the good kind of attachment, as opposed to the necessity for separation.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely the case. I teach in a psychology department, so I'm kind of aware of how the notion of attachment has become a kind of psychological currency. And your assessment, I think, is absolutely apt and correct. It's more a sense of, well, how does one maintain somehow attachment, or the positivity of attachment, and an implicitly negative loading of what some kind of separation might be. So that was kind of a great moment in the book, or it happens multiple times, just a realization of that importance. And of course, if we turn to Seminar 11 and Lacan, you see that he is he's spending quite a lot of energy on thinking, well, I have theorized alienation in the signifier, alienation in the big other, alienation in the symbolic so much that it becomes kind of a conceptual imperative to be able to think what a type of separation might be. And of course, it's a crucial point in Lacan. But just to come back, go ahead.
No, it's a beautiful point too, because there's something for me, and this comes up in various ways throughout the book, that the drive itself pushes towards separation. And that part of the reason that we care about the drive, or we care about the circuit of the drive, or that we follow the drive in the speech or in the transference of the patient in order to bring it round. And also, by the way, the drive as coming from the body and returning to the body, is that it's marking a separation. It's marking a differentiation.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderfully put.